Welcome to the Decentralized Opportunity Podcast, a weekly podcast discussing innovative ideas in business and technology from unconventional and often overlooked sources. I'm your host, Tanner Lytle, here with your other host,
Wyatt. Carson. Tanner, I know we're both excited for today's interview. I'm just going to jump into it.
Yeah.
I want you to introduce our guests. I knew Charlie was coming on, but we have another guest I'm very excited for, and probably I forgot to read my invitation. But go ahead, Tanner, introduce our guest. Let's jump in.
Yeah, so we are joined today by Cuddy and John Grange from Move Venture Capital and the Nebraska Startup Academy. So, hey guys, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Hey, glad to be here.
Yeah, so I am super, like what I said, I'm super excited to have you guys. I was just talking with Charlie a little bit beforehand. The whole concept of venture capital and startups and all that is so close to my heart. Starting off my very first company when I was 21, we won a business plan competition to get some seed money to get things going. So just having guys like you, companies like you who are willing to reach out, especially in the Nebraska community, find people who have great ideas and bolster them up when maybe they didn't have the opportunity beforehand. Hence, in the theme of our Decentralized Opportunity podcast, is so valuable. So I'm really excited to get to meet you guys, learn a little bit more about you. And I guess the first question to kind of kick it off for the audience is like, who are you? And what's kind of been this journey to get to where you are today?
We'll start with John.
John?
Just call out a person so we don't get everyone talking over each other. John.
I was waiting for like an eye twitch from Charlie that he was going to go first or something like that. So the way I kind of got into this was really being a serial entrepreneur here in Nebraska. Grew up in the Omaha metro area, kind of had a path into the startup world that was, a little bit like I guess kind of what like your grandma usually thinks, like how startups happen. Like I had something to kind of blow up a little bit while I was in college. I ended up, we built a pretty cool company in like an apartment, and like I dropped out of college and like it did really well and I had a good exit and stuff like that. So like that's sort of what thrust me into startups as like a career path. And then since then, I've been kind of investing and building other startups. And my most recent one is Ops Compass, which is a platform for cloud and data security. And that's actually kind of how Charlie and I got connected. We acquired a company that Charlie was doing some work with. And so along the way, I've raised a lot of venture capital here. I've just, again, done a lot of kind of startup activity here. And what was always really obvious to me was we have basically no options for founders at the very, very earliest stages and at the very, very late stages. So that's where kind of the Move Venture Capital and the Startup Academy kind of got started for me. So I'll let Charlie's story is like way more interesting than mine. So
No, John mentioned how we kind of got connected, and right before we got connected, I was actually teaching high school math, coaching cross country and track here in Omaha at public school, and noticed that a lot of our opportunities for some of our students who maybe weren't going to college were a little bit limited. And so just kind of, one thing led to another. I got pretty plugged in the tech scene. I saw that as a opportunity to kind of close the gap for some of the students that maybe, it's kind of goes back to the whole thing. Like, you don't know what you don't know. Like a lot of my students had spent their time on phones, but not computers. And so I learned, I got plugged in the tech community, started learning kind of enough code to be dangerous, but got my master's in curriculum development to build out our school's first like computer programming course. But in doing so, I taught that for a couple of years, but in doing so, stayed really connected with a lot of people in the community, and had an opportunity to work some nights, some weekends for a startup. So I was kind of exploring what that was. And in the meantime of doing that is when the company got acquired by John and Ops Compass. And so I sat down with John and his partner, Manny, and kind of laid out a plan of like, hey, have you ever thought of making a transition into the tech startup scene? So ultimately did that and came on and worked with those guys as a customer success, kind of cloud engineer over at Ops Compass and did that for a handful of years. And then in the process of building out a lot of the curriculum I was doing, I was just trying to gather any resources, and there was a lot here in Nebraska to gather, but I also wanted to pull from other sources. And that's kind of where I started getting plugged in with like Jason Kalkanis and some of the other players at a larger stage here in the US, and following them on social media, but working with John. And one day Jason put out a tweet that was like, hey, I'm looking for someone with a background in curriculum and interest in startups that wants to work directly with me to like revolutionize early stage education in the Silicon Valley area. So like I talked to John and was like, I got to throw my hat in the ring here. Like this kind of once in a lifetime opportunity. I seem to fit what they're looking for. But loved working with John and Manny and the team. So it was a tough decision, but essentially raised my hand on Twitter, and Jason set up an interview and got hired and went out there and spent a few years building a educational program, kind of top of funnel for entrepreneurs with Jason, which turned out to just be a lot of fun. Met a ton of great people from kind of all over the world through this program. And that kind of laid the foundation. We started seeing a lot of Nebraska companies or Nebraska founders start showing interest in the program. John and I had continued to be, in close conversations, and he's talked about his challenges raising capital here in the Midwest. A lot of the numbers, a lot of the blog posts are all very coastal. And so even just kind of getting information to, you see, I got to raise, how much money to even get started? How do I reach $1 billion? And like these numbers, just as great as they are, you can make a meaningful impact in the Midwest by maybe dividing some of those by I don't know, a 5, a 10, maybe a bigger number, and still have an impact. So yeah, that was kind of where we started the Move venture capital firm idea, and essentially the Nebraska Startup Academy to supplement the educational pieces with the great resources we have here in the state.
So to summarize, over a couple of years, you went from high school math teacher to co-founder of a venture capital firm. Like you say this so casually, John. You acquired Ops Compass, is that right? No,
I started Ops Compass, but we ended up acquiring a couple companies. One of which was a software development shop that Charlie was doing some community development work for. So
okay. And you met Charlie and you're like, I kind of like this guy. And then a few years later, here you guys are. Like, you guys say this so casually, but this is a huge adventure. You ran off and did some work with JCal. I mean, that's how Tanner and I ultimately became aware of you. We did Founders University. We talked about it on this podcast, and we loved it. We learned so much. And for you to take that knowledge and bring it back to Nebraska, I guess my next question for both of you is, why Nebraska? Why invest in Nebraska? What is it personally to you?
I've been asked that like so many times, just because because a lot of like Nebraska startups will kind of start with their core initial customers, or their first kind of POC is with a Nebraska company. But my first company that got me into this, we were the commercial entity that had the best support for an open source platform that people used around the world. So I had customers all over the world and like none in Nebraska. And we were just like kids. So like, you don't know what you don't know, as Charlie said earlier. So like along the way, I've always had people say like, why haven't you moved from Nebraska? You guys could you'd be so much bigger if you moved out to, San Francisco and whatever. And I'm usually in San Francisco when somebody's telling me that. And my answer is usually like, I don't know, like I'm here right now. There's planes. I think for me, it's a little bit of the mindset that makes an entrepreneur, which is I'm a little bit stubborn, and I just kind of have a vision for things such as my life. And I like living here, and it's unacceptable to me that there's not a real practical reason why I can't build really anything in Nebraska. So I've just kind of always thought, well, screw it, I'm going to do it.
Stubbornness, that's a Nebraska trait.
Well, I think both of us just being here, and, there's a lot of smart people building really great things. And, I think just being open and listening to people who found success and like what was missing, see if we can't help build some of the, support system that needs to be there, or find resources. That's a big part of what our vision for the Academy to be is, find the resources. Like, we're never going to pretend that we have all of the answers to anything. We have our experiences that we can share, and then we'll leverage people in our community that want to see Nebraska succeed, that have different experiences and different expertise, but allow the founders to continue building the thing that they're the expert on. And when they hit roadblocks, like, allow the Academy to be kind of a sounding board, or a place to go and do some of the work to prevent them from having to get off track and find the shiny objects that distract from, building a startup.
Yeah, when you're building a startup here in Nebraska, like I mentioned earlier about what the we have very few like really, really early stage capital options and few late. Like, when you're talking about building a company here, one of the reasons not to is just like, gosh, it's harder to raise capital. So like, one of the things, that's what Charlie and I wanted to do, is start to really address that, just because we have a network of startup friends, founder friends and things like that. And really smart, totally build stuff here. And just, you gotta, if you're going to raise a seed round, more often than not, you gotta have had some sort of pre-seed or friends and family round. So we wanted to really be able to have an institutionalized source of capital at that stage here, just to make it more appealing for other people to build here and not kind of get pulled away elsewhere on top of that. So
I'd also add, like, one of the things that like everyone taking remote meetings over the last few years that really kind of shone a light on, while I was working for Jason, is like, previously he would make everyone go to San Francisco for like their accelerator. So it's a 16-week course, and they either had to find a place to stay or they fly out every week for their weekly meetings. Like, it had to be in person. And then, all of a sudden it was like, oh, wait a minute, if we do these on Zoom, we could do 2 or 3 at a time. We could be way more efficient. We could, instead of seeing 6 or 7 companies, we could put together a team and maybe see 14 or 21, start staggering things. And so that part of it too was like, we thought it, like, just from a timing perspective, it just couldn't have been better. Of like, we believed you could build stuff here, but like, other people were starting to come around to like, hey, we'll take a meeting with you, even if you're in Nebraska, or even if you're in these places that we don't really know where they are on a map, but we've heard of them.
Yeah, the catalyst actually for this podcast came from a similar discussion where I was talking with a pretty high executive at a Fortune 100 company, and we got talking on this subject of in-person versus remote work in particular. And he was talking that, oh, well, you need people to be in the office in these metro areas because, you have all the collaboration and stuff. And I kind of pushed back, where I was like, well, I live in McCook, which is Southwest Nebraska, a town of 7,000 people. And the company that I currently work for, they wouldn't have access to me if they were only doing things in person. And it sounds, it's very similar to what you guys are talking about with seeds and opportunities. Like, oh, well, we only invest in people who are, we can meet in San Francisco, compared to there's a ton of, whether it be just talent for companies or people building companies that live, rural communities, live off anywhere. And this new world is so great because, well, we're essentially all neighbors. We can all just talk on Zoom or whatever platform and work hand in hand, and it's pretty fantastic.
I definitely think so.
And we see it too with a bunch of like the resources that, as people move here, talked to a couple founders that have moved from Seattle, Las Vegas, San Francisco, and they're just like, oh my gosh, like, the stuff that we can build here, it's like almost all the resources are essentially free in comparison, and like what we can do at with less money, or all of that is a total game changer as well. Like, to the point you're asking earlier about like, why are you still here in Nebraska? It's just like, I don't know, you show up and take a look around and see what you can do here. I think it's a total game changer.
Yeah. And there's also something about growing up in a place, especially more of a rural area, where you got to be a little bit more scrappy or stubborn, like you said, John, where you be more, you take all the resources you have and you can solve problems that way, compared to being more specialized or following the same traditional paths. And there's something about being an outsider and coming up with unique solutions, or, to certain problems that other people don't think about. And man, that just changes the dynamic of, a team or a company, and the partnerships where you get all these non-traditional perspectives as well.
Well, it's also what's interesting about Nebraska from like a venture capital kind of thesis perspective for us is that, Nebraska founders tend to um, uh, use less capital, for instance, in the life of the business. So they have to raise less money. Nebraska founders can have sub, 40 or $50 million exits and still make a lot of money. And the investors, it creates tremendous returns for investors. You can have a 20x return on a company that has an exit that in the, if all you're reading is TechCrunch, a $35 million exit isn't going to sound like much to you. But if you only raised $6 million and it took you 3 years to do, 4 years to do, that's a very compelling. Like outside of, I just love that stuff like that that you can do that in Nebraska. That's a great business opportunity, and that's what also was very appealing to Charlie and I about the pre-seed stage here. It's just like nobody's noticed that it's like very valuable to be in that early, and it helps founders and it kind of helps things get going. And so that's another thing that's very interesting about investing here from a thesis perspective.
Yeah, you can also really see how it can affect communities and things like that. Getting an injection of millions of dollars potentially, whether it be in the Omaha area, Lincoln, or some of these smaller towns. That's a lot of jobs to bring in. That's a lot of just excitement and things that can go with that compared to, again, just another startup in San Francisco. Well, a startup in Lincoln or in Omaha or in McCook, that's a big deal. It drives a lot to the community.
Yeah, think about how many people when they see that big startup have an exit in Lincoln or whatever, how many people that influences to start something else. Like
it's infectious for sure.
We've interviewed lots of people so far on this podcast, and the vast majority of them say one of their biggest issues, and it's not even an issue about being in Nebraska or a rural business, is money. We've talked to a gentleman from Binkelman who started Dog Orthotics, O'Neill, Nebraska, who started the Copper Mug. We were talking about Handle Bend. Lots of people talk about how sometimes it takes extra long to start something like that in Nebraska because the access to this kind of education through your Nebraska Startup Academy and the potential venture capital funds, they're very hard. And you go to a bank here, you can't get a new business loan because, a point we heard in a previous podcast is Nebraska's an agriculture state. If you want an ag loan, there's tons of those around. If you want a new business loan, those are harder to get in Nebraska. So are you working with a lot of people outside of the Omaha area? I live in Omaha as well. But are you starting to work with a lot of people outside of the Omaha, Lincoln area, further west, Grand Island, Kearney, those areas?
Yeah, totally. I mean, we're meeting with, we had calls just this week with Grand Island, Aurora founders, building things. And one of our biggest pieces with any of them, it's like, it goes back to kind of the education piece. I think people, when they hear like, hey, I'm going to start a business, I am going to raise venture capital. Hey, there's this new thing called Move. I'll get introduced. And it's like, great, we want to meet any and every founder. And, John and I both have total alignment on we'll take any meeting with any founder because who knows what that thing's going to be from the back of a napkin to actually launching to, 2 years from now. So, we place a lot of bets on founders and their ideas and those types of things. But in terms of just access to capital, to your point, like we're totally open with, hey, have you thought about is venture capital really the best route for you? Like, do you really want to put us on a cap table if you're looking to never raise again and you're going to be have this nice business, in a year or two that's, return enough money that you don't really need to grow it anymore. And so just talking about other players in the state with them and making intros to, a lot of the other people that are doing similar things, but maybe in a different space, and just making sure that we get more stuff built. That's ultimately what we, would deem a success with the Academy, but also, in order to do that, we believe Move will see great returns as well. So absolutely meeting people all over the state.
Yeah. Is there any surprises in your, in terms of the response that you've got since you've been started, or what's kind of the feeling since you began?
We looked at some of the numbers specifically around Invest Nebraska put out a report of the last $1 billion invested in Nebraska startups. And, it was I think there was 20 some B or later it was like 40 or 50 Series A, so kind of working backwards, and it was like 150 pre-seed, and then it was like 45 seed stage. And it's just like, from a pure logical numbers perspective, these numbers don't make any sense. Like, you it's one thing, like, if you're going to celebrate, one of our, I always joke around, like, if you're going to celebrate like kid's third birthday at the seed stage, like, it's great if you didn't acknowledge it, but they still had a first and second birthday, and they were around in order to get there. So it's like, there had to be more companies than this. So we had a pretty strong feeling that there were a lot of early stage companies out there. But I would say, we kind of made a goal of talking to around 150 to 200 in this first year, and to try and get that down to 10, 15, 20 investments, kind of depending on where we were. And, here we are, April 6th, and we'll probably, I think we're at like 146 founders that we've already talked to across the state. So that the pent up demand was a bit surprising, but we kind of anticipated it. We just weren't sure how quickly we could find them, I guess.
Yeah, when we were talking to initial LPs, and when you're first time fund managers, even like, we talked to a lot of people that, like, I've raised money from before as a founder, but like, we have no background as fund managers, so they're taking a chance. But the more or less provocative part of our plan was the number of investments we were planning to make. And the pushback we often would get is, our original thesis said we were going to do 65 deals over 3 years. And you wouldn't believe how many people would say to us, are there 65 deals to be had in Nebraska? And it's like, well, we knew there were, like Charlie said. I mean, another kind of data point is we do a little over, on average, 25 seed rounds a year in Nebraska per year, and fewer than 10 pre-seed rounds. So somehow we find, 25, 26, 27 like seed investable startups from a base of like less than 10. So that tells you that there's a gap there. But here we are now, and we're actually kind of retuning our model a little bit. Our check sizes are a little smaller so we can get into more things, because we're just finding like way more things than we thought. Like, 65 was our provocative number, and in reality, we'll probably end up doing closer to 80. So that's been the biggest surprise for me.
Yeah. So you mentioned terms like LP and stuff like that. Can you explain how the venture capital kind of structure works for somebody who's listening, who's unfamiliar with how the whole investment startup process is?
You want to take it, John? I mean, I can. I'll start here. So yeah, essentially, raising John and I as the general partners, along with our other partner Manny, structured this idea, and we went out and fundraised essentially the same way that a founder would go out and fundraise for their startup. So we have to find high net worth individuals, enterprises, endowments, private offices, places that have enough capital to invest. So the SEC has some regulations around who is allowed to invest in the private equity companies, or some of these startups before they've gone public. So essentially, we are the general partners. We go out, find these individuals who want to put money into a fund like Move. They become limited partners. So they believe in our vision, believe in our strategy, believe in us as a team to make good investment decisions for them, and then return money as the startups start to grow, scale, raise future rounds of funding, and ultimately have some kind of exit.
That was good and succinct, Charlie.
That was really good. Yeah. So my question is, and I think this question comes from a personal experience. When I started launch with Tanner, I guess I didn't understand venture capital and what that meant. And you made a really good point at the beginning, talking about, I think a lot of founders need to evaluate if they want to go with venture capital or not, and what that means. So could you elaborate a little bit on, if you're a founder and you have this business thing, and maybe you've done some pre-seed, or you've gained enough to grow some momentum, and you start considering venture capital, could you explain the pros and cons of that and what that would mean from a founder?
You want to tackle that, John, as a founder
Yeah.
that's raised multiple?
Sure. so a lot of it comes, it's all about like scalability. Like venture capital investors are, it's venture capital is an asset class, just like cash and just like stocks and real estate and other things. And venture capital just happens to be like one of the riskiest asset classes there are. So high net worth individuals, institutions will, as they're kind of planning their portfolio and planning their investments, they cordon off a small piece of it, usually for venture capital, because it is high risk, but also high reward. So with that being said, when you've got a concept and you're thinking about, is this a venture capital investable concept? A good way to think about it is like, if I raise $1 million, is this the type of business that could make a 10x return on that for that investor that gave me $1 million? And if it's not, then there's probably a different type of capitalization that would make sense for you if you need $1 million to build something. Like if you're doing something with a lot of like fixed assets, there's often a lot of good kind of debt to equity type formats, or banks where if there's something tangible, banks always understand that a little bit more, particularly if it's ag around here, as mentioned earlier. So yeah, a venture kind of scalable business is something that's going to have that efficiency and scalability built in, and you can kind of envision a world where this thing just really blows up, for lack of a more technical term. Does that make sense?
Makes
I don't know.
sense.
Yeah, there was a term that always stuck with me, or an example from Founders U, and it was like investment capital is rocket fuel, and you only put rocket fuel into rockets because if you put it into a car, it'll explode. So you got to make sure it's the right, the right fuel for you and your example. And a lot of people think too that it's like, oh, I have this idea, I'm just going to go raise money, I'm going to do these things, and even if it's a good idea, invest that kind of money might add the wrong types of pressures or incentives or things like that that might not be good for the long-term success of your business or for you as a founder.
It's why venture capitalists you can find venture capitalists that'll invest in specific, verticals or specific cases, but oftentimes they tend towards software, things with high margins that can grow quickly without taking on a lot of other expenses, are interesting because they're, not super capital intensive up front. To John's point, hard to, Jason always said, hardware is hard. And part of that is it's so expensive up front before you even can validate if it's going to be a good idea, where, 50, 100K can go a long way if you're building a software application.
Yeah, and I think that there's a misconception, and we deal with it all the time. It's like that VCs are just are obsessed with software just because software is cool and because a lot of us built software. And it's like the reality of it is, it's like software is cool. I think it's cool, but what VCs like about software is the leverage you get by being able to write the code once and sell it 1,000 times. That's why JCal loves investing in software companies. That's why there's VCs all over the world that like specialize in just investing in SaaS. But what Charlie and I hear all the time from founders in Nebraska is like, hey, like they almost feel like if they have an idea that's not that they're not, almost like not welcome kind of in the startup ecosystem, and that, it's just not even part of the venture capital conversation. And that's just not true. And at Move, we've already made investments in scalable, totally venture scalable, non-software companies. I mean, anymore today, there's a little bit of a software component to almost everything, but it doesn't always, there's like everything else. It's not always as simple, but the simple thing is software is almost always venture scalable, but everything else, you kind of have to really think about the business. So I know I've definitely wanted to make it a point to like invest in some of these things coming out of Nebraska that aren't quite as clear day one, that it's like you can kind of squint your eyes and you can kind of see a world where, man, they really blow this thing up and you really like the founder, and really encourage people to like, look, I get not everything's software, like, and you can still build things, like, let's go.
And that was a big piece with sorry. I just wanted to mention that was a big piece of like one of our goals with the Academy too. It's like it doesn't matter what kind of business you have, like whether we invest or not, like you have to think about how you're going to make money. Like the Academy can help you think through how you'll make money. Can help think through how will you scale, and like at what point is that how big you're comfortable with it being. Like, what about an actual go to market plan once you have something capable of being launched? How do you acquire customers? How do you think about hiring a team? Like all of these things, like it doesn't matter if it's venture capital or not. You're going to have to think through these things, and that's the part where the academy kind of overlays, where we felt like we could kind of fill a gap, and to John's point, really kind of help bring some of the pieces together, where it was like, oh, I'm not a technology startup, I'm not welcome in this kind of ecosystem, because it's just not true. And the way that things can change so quickly in kind of any of these ecosystems, like, I don't know, our whole thing is like, we want to help anyone here build stuff in Nebraska, but then also selfishly, like, their next thing might be something that's venture scalable that we're interested in. There might be some new innovation that happens that allows them to take their kind of lifestyle business and pivot it pretty quickly into a venture scalable. And then all of a sudden we're way more interested from the move side of things as well.
Yeah. So to kind of continue with that thought, let's say we have somebody, this is a two-part question, kind of two sides to the same coin though. So you have somebody who, potentially wants to get in touch with you guys. What are the pieces, parts, stages, prerequisites needed, to get for them to come to you and really start, at least in the investment stage, to have the pieces that they need? But also in the flip side, what are some of the things that are common misconceptions, or where people are somewhat delusional, coming to you way too early and not being ready? What does that kind of look like?
One of the things with our thesis is like, I I don't know that there's really a stage that we would say is delusionally too early. Like, we would be interested in talking to kind of anyone. I mean, obviously, you run up against a point of like, if I invest in Tanner's company now, that's one company less than I can invest in 2 or 3 years from now, as we kind of go up on the 65, 75 companies that we're looking to invest in. So like, you do end up kind of getting into a little bit of a, like, okay, if I have these three companies, which one makes the most sense to invest in now? And it kind of goes back to like, well, obviously, like, no customer, or like having some customers is better than no customers. Having no customers is better than like no product. But like, we'll invest in, an early product without, one of our investments we've already made had a very rough MVP that they were about to launch, hadn't fully launched it yet. Like, so pre-revenue, kind of pre-product, but by the time the wire hit, was like a product was launched and they have a customer. So like that, I don't think there's really someone that would be too early for us to at least talk to. And then we'd be pretty transparent with like, hey, if the founder is an expert in the space, they have an idea that, could be potentially disruptive. They have like a network that could maybe heighten their chances of bringing on early customers. We maybe pull the trigger there in a situation where traditionally we might have thought it was too early in the terms. But there's just different ways you can de-risk some of these things, and it's just kind of a matter of how many of these attributes show up in the conversation. Totally. Yeah. And there, it goes back to like how serious, like part of it would just be us feeling out like, how serious are you as a founder? If it's an idea that like you've had for the last 6 years and still haven't moved on it, like that's different than an idea that, just kind of came to you because of an expert position that you have, at a current company that, you have some kind of experience or something like that. But yeah, I mean, a product is, if you had a product and you don't have a product, like if we had to pick one, okay, we'll probably go with the product, but we wouldn't ignore the conversation, I guess. I don't know if you have anything to add there, John.
It's kind of funny, since we're just like early on in our journey here, we're just getting started. We're, you kind of jump into an existing flow of things here in Nebraska, stuff getting started. And Charlie would probably agree with me that our bigger frustration is not people too delusionally early. Our thesis is around being first check in on these things. So as he said, like we actually like being very early. It's we come across stuff we really like that it's too late for us. They're a little bit too far along. Our thesis is really pre-seed. If somebody like there's a company out of Lincoln that Charlie and I both really, really liked. And it was that first moment, I think, in our journey where we were both like, dang, our thesis won't allow for this. Like, we really like it, but it's like they've already raised $1 million. Like, they're pretty far along. Like, so that's in Nebraska. There's just no culture around here for like pre-seed. So like people are like kind of afraid, like, gosh, I'm going to make an intro for you guys, but just warning you, like really early on, don't have a product yet. They don't have any like LOIs lined up for potential customers. And we're just like, yes, let's go. Like we'd love to talk. Like that's exactly where we're playing.
One of the things, with my experience working with Jason, like, through that Founder University program, I think there's about 850 founders that I was working directly with. So like far from an expert, but got a great feel for kind of where might this idea concept kind of fit versus like, is it an actual actionable thing that someone's going to go take, action on? And then like John's experience too, is just from a technology perspective, who's built a lot of things, is able to kind of also have that kind of founder view of things, like how easy would this be to actually get off the ground? How likely is it? Who's building it? If they have this elaborate plan, but it's going to require like 12 months of outsourcing, that's totally different than like them having the ability to work on this in their free time type of thing. So there's a lot of things that go into it, but totally open to those conversations for sure.
So I want to take it back a step and hit the Nebraska Startup Academy again. So the move, the venture capital part, that's the entrepreneurship in both of you, and then the Nebraska Startup Academy education, right? And I think I can't remember, one of you two said it, and I even wrote it in quotes: pent up demand. I love that concept, because in Nebraska, Tanner and I are on this journey where we're meeting all of these wonderful people from Nebraska and other places, but mostly in Nebraska centered, who are trying to make something out of nothing. And some people who have succeeded in building something out of nothing. But ultimately, the conclusion we've come to is everyone has a business idea. Everyone in the world has thought, I could do that. And most people don't. And we understand that. And that's why entrepreneurship is both hard and can be rewarding. But with the Nebraska Startup Academy, what's your vision? What's your goal with this?
We've talked a lot about the founder side. Like there's another piece of it too that we really see. But part of it is getting really connected with all of the amazing things entrepreneurial that are happening in Nebraska and in the Midwest. There's so many just absolutely brilliant people that have noticed this same kind of thing that John and I and that you guys have seen, of a lot of great resources that are siloed. And it's like, if I don't know these 3 people and know the secret password to get into this room, like I don't know that this exists. So like the big vision for the Academy is just to kind of have a high friendly, work with everybody attitude of, these are great resources across the state. We can help you in this situation, but this person that we know would be way better to do that, and just kind of pulling people into our network. John mentioned like we're pretty plugged in, far from the most plugged in, but we want to get into the rooms with the people that are plugged in and just kind of continually overlay these great groups of people, and just make more and more resources available. That high level is kind of what I envision the Academy being. To a more detailed perspective, like some of the things that were amazing with like the Startup Collaborative a few years back, about just having actually tangible modules that maybe we do in person, maybe they're just asynchronous type consumption that becomes almost like an open source where people can contribute their expertise in those plays. But one of the pieces that I'm also really excited about is like, we see entrepreneurship as a two-sided marketplace here, where you can have all these great ideas and all these founders, but they need the capital as well. So kind of almost filling the problem that we've talked about we have plans to have the academy also educate the investor side of things here. We have a lot of high net worth individuals that are maybe in careers that they don't maybe totally recognize investing as an angel is something that's possible for them. So setting up classes for some of our surgeons or some of our attorneys or different groups of people to say, hey, if you've ever been interested in diversifying kind of your investment, the small piece you want to carve off, and try and make it easier for them to write small checks into Nebraska-based startups, would be something that would also be really interesting.
Yeah, I know you do a lot of office hours and things like that. And kind of the overarching theme that we're talking about too is community and kind of trying to get yourself into that community. What resources are out there today for founders, like your office hours or different events that someone might be able to, look up, see when the next dates are, and go to?
Yeah, it's funny you bring up the VC office hours. We've been doing those since the beginning of the year. Wednesday mornings, basically just having an open house up here in Omaha. We've got our second one in Lincoln next week. But we basically treated it exactly like we would a startup, right? We had this idea. We have a kind of a product. We have a curriculum laid out. We have live events planned, all of these things. But it was like, before we just spend all this time and energy launching something, like, let's get out and talk to the people, see, are there people that will come to this stuff? What do they actually need? And so that's what our VC office hours have been about so far, is just having a casual conversation and seeing who's building stuff, where are they at in their journey, to kind of validate the market in that regard, the same way you would almost with a product. But there's a ton of great stuff happening up here. I can maybe share a link with you and that has some great stuff afterwards, if that's okay. But like our big thing is with the academy also is we want to tag along with other things that we love happening. So like, we're like, all right, we want to do VC office hours. Well, let's find a great event, that we think would be great for our community, the people in our network, to start attending. So we reached out to the 1 Million Cups organizers here in Omaha, and we're like, hey, your thing's from 8 to 9. We would love, we would love to just follow that up, from 9 to 11, 9 to noon. Encourage our network to come to, show up a half hour early and catch the talk, and then maybe people that are already coming to 1 Million Cups that have different expertise can stick around and talk with some of the entrepreneurs. So doing the same thing when we go down to Lincoln, talking with people in Lincoln, and they have a similar open coffee on Thursday. So it's like, yeah, let's go tag team with that. And so there's great events like Scale Omaha and things that we'd love to, or we plan to have, like some of our angel investing type things piggyback off of, or prior to some of their events, to just create more, collisions in the spaces.
Yeah, I was just thinking that exact word, just like meeting up in person creates all these different collisions. And then from that, you might meet, somebody who supplements your skill set really well. And from that can spawn a startup and some ideas, or different people. Maybe have an idea, but they're not a technical founder and they need someone who could execute on that, or vice versa, not a great salesperson or design person. So I think that's a really great resource. Is there anything online that people could do? Are you trying to form any groups or forums, Discord channels, Slack channels, anything like that?
So that's another piece that we have totally in play, and we're trying to kind of plug in with people in the space. It's like, how many websites can we have that say this is the place to get your entrepreneurial news, and then it feels like 4 to 6 months later it's kind of lost its zeal and those types of things. So like, we are in talks of that, and hopefully here by maybe this summer have something along those lines of almost similar to like what you experienced at Founder University, like a community-based kind of learning platform that, hey, it doesn't matter what city you're in, but being able to easily connect with people that are going to similar events, different events, having stuff live online, and just kind of letting the different groups organize their own kind of, John as a developer or technician loves like the open source concept. And I think there's just a lot of power to making stuff available and allowing people to contribute.
Wonderful. Well, gentlemen, we're nearing our time. I just want to recap real quick that this has been an awesome conversation with 4 people who really love Nebraska and who really love business and who really love empowering other people to explore those opportunities. So Charlie, John, where can people go and find more? I'm in rural McCook, Nebraska, and this Nebraska Startup Academy sounds like just what I've been looking for. Where can people learn more about you gentlemen and also what you're working on?
Yeah, so we post a lot of our events through just LinkedIn right now as we build out our website even more. Feels like we've been doing this forever, and January 1st was our official date for both of these things. So I've had a few balls in the air as we're rolling. So I would say, for right now, the LinkedIn is where we're absolutely the most active. But we also have our websites. I mean, I can drop them in the chat too. They're that might just be easier than saying out all of the.
Fair enough. Absolutely. And of course, we'll
cool.
link everything in the show notes of the podcast, of course. So, what we encourage people is check the show notes, go out, find Charlie, find John, connect with them. They're doing really great things for Nebraska and for startups in general. And of course, we'll link everything because we want people to find you. I think you're providing an awesome service, both in the education, the Startup Academy, and then venture capital, which is something that's sorely missing here. So props to you guys. Tanner, final thoughts, questions, anything?
Yeah, no, thanks so much for joining us, guys. I'm definitely going to point a lot of people your direction, and I'm hoping next week I can join you and meet you in person for one of your office hours. If not next week, I'll make it a point on a following one. I'd like to drive the great span of Nebraska to go to Omaha and Lincoln as much as possible and leave my basement, which is great. So.
Well, we have plans of, pushing this out across, all different cities within the state of Nebraska. So if there's people that are organizing and already kind of there, and there's opportunities for us to drop in and sit in a corner of some great, program that's already going. We've been talking to a couple of founders in Grand Island that are doing some great things that, we would love to come and participate and be a part of that and not force everybody to drive to Lincoln and Omaha for everything. So happy to do that as well if they reach out with any of those types of things.
Yeah, that sounds great. The further west you can get, the better for me. But also, there's so many people who can't drive the 4 hours or just don't have it time. But again, the collisions that can happen are going to be fantastic. So again, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks to everybody who's listened and made it this far. Do check out Charlie and John's website. Reach out, connect with them, especially if you have an idea and want to try to grow something yourself. So, all right. Well, we'll see everybody next week. Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.